Hello, everyone. Welcome to the FCC's online Zoom events. Thank you so much for joining us today for this lunch talk with Erich Schwartzel, who I have on here with me live from Los Angeles. So today's talk will be a really exciting and rich topic that I'm sure is something that touches everybody who watches television, anybody who watches movies, goes to the cinemas. Erich has just put out his new book, Red Carpet, Hollywood, China, and the Global Battle for Cultural Supremacy. The book was published just early this February, so really one of the most latest releases we have here at the FCC, and looks at China's growing influence in Hollywood and how movies have become a proxy battleground for the ideological rivalry between the US and China. And the book's already gotten rave reviews from the New York Times Book Reviews, from Foreign Affairs, was featured on NPR's Fresh Air with Terry Gross. And yeah, we're very grateful to have Erich here today. Just a quick bio. Erich is a reporter with the Wall Street Journal. He's covered the film industry since 2013. And before joining the Journal, he covered the energy industry for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Thank you, Erich. Thanks for being here.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here. I'm thrilled to talk about the book, but I also have to say that one of my reporting trips in doing the book was to Hong Kong, and it was one of my favorite reporting trips I had taken. I think it was back in 2019 that I was there.
Yeah, that was a very interesting time to be here, and definitely not possible with the COVID restrictions now. So it's great that you came in. So Erich, I'd just like to start off really by asking, you started covering the film industry, you started covering Hollywood from 2013. When and how did China start becoming a major factor in your beat? I mean, you write in your book that you began to see it everywhere. Maybe just talk us through, there were so many different, obviously, topics at the time, but how and why did China start looming large?
Yeah, my timing was pretty good because I joined the Journal in 2013. And 2013 was when we started to see a lot of the Chinese influence break through in specific ways. And so it started out pretty small. There'd be a casting announcement that Fan Bingbing had been cast in an X-Men movie, or some Chinese financier, some random Chinese billionaire was coming to LA and going to finance a string of Hollywood releases. And the Chinese box office was still relatively small as a foreign market, but it was growing. And you would hear these stories of China building 27 new movie screens a day. And so everyone knew it was going to be a bigger deal. But I think in Hollywood, there was a sense that it was China's dumb money. It was not going to really last. I mean, there's a long history of countries or just random people coming to Hollywood with stars in their eyes and losing money very quickly. And so I think it was perceived to be an economic story and a short-lived one. And I think that the key distinction that I tried to make and I started to make was that it was also a political story. And that even if some of the economic factors that we saw were fading or eventually would fade, that there was a longer game here. And so then, as the contrast between the US or the West and China grew starker, it became even more a political story than an economic one in Hollywood.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And what do you think underscores or sort of drives the political nature of that story, right? I mean, your book really researches how and when China started viewing Hollywood or viewing movies as a form of soft culture, right? And start to realize that, really this is something they could harness. Can you talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I think it's very much an effort to replicate what Hollywood did for America in the 20th century, which there's this phrase that a political scientist I talked to used. He said that soft power and American culture had turned the US into an empire by invitation, a place that people had this kind of gravitational pull toward. And certainly the kind of image of America that I grew up with, that I think a lot of people grew up with, as this kind of this kind of this place of like a gravitational pull of cool, right? Like that there was just something pulling people toward it with our culture. And the American movie was the most dominant global medium of the 20th century. So I think there are very explicit efforts to replicate that in China's own way, right? And to sort of mold that playbook to China's aims and China's way of doing business. I mean, I would even talk to Hollywood executives who back in the 80s or 90s would go to China and be told, you know, we just read this paper, this white paper on soft power. What is that? What can you tell us about it? I mean, they were like really, it was, you know, the kind of the knowledge transfer was that deliberate in some respects. I think that's changed a little bit though under the current regime, because China's aggression and its sort of more inward focus has made sure that soft power exporting is as important as any sort of internal control it can use culture to maintain. So I think that works in two ways in Hollywood. One is a way that we all know very well, which is movies get sent to Beijing and the censors decide whether or not they're allowed in or what they have to cut before they're shown in China. I think the phenomenon that I was really interested in kind of exploring was more just how movies outside of China are being changed, such that for the past 20 years, no American movie has really portrayed China in much complexity at all. Forgetting just sort of making movies about any of the political third rails that we all know, any portrayal of China has to be either positive to neutral, whether it's even just showing a city scene with trash on the street. And so it's allowed the American movie, still the dominant form of entertainment shipped around the world, to sort of become a bit of a de facto commercial for China, because no movie is going to portray China or have any sort of Chinese aesthetic that the CCP might take an issue with.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I think it would be probably good to go back to the whole 7 years in Tibet fiasco, right? And what that meant, you know, for Hollywood. And you discussed Kundun as well, the Disney film. And I think that would be a good just a refresher of how like things weren't always like this, right? I mean, Hollywood, Richard Gere, I mean, everyone remembers like how bold and how, you know, confrontational, right? Hollywood actors could be. And then, you know, you sort of fast forward to today with John Cena, you see something like totally different. So I think it would be really, really fascinating to hear what you sort of discovered about, you know, 7 years in Hollywood and 7 years in Tibet, and how that changed Hollywood, and how, you know, broaching Tibet and the Tibet issue was really sort of like the first reckoning Hollywood had to have with China.
No, absolutely. It was this cautionary tale. And when I would go back and I would read coverage at the time, it was so fascinating, because it was one of those examples where it feels like nothing is new, right? Like we just sort of repeat the same cycles over and over again. And the story of 7 years in Tibet, which was this Sony film released in 1997, based on a memoir about a German guy who found himself in Tibet shortly after the war and became a tutor to a young Dalai Lama. Brad Pitt plays the German, and so the film was made by Sony with no expectation of playing in China, because in 1997 Hollywood movies had been flowing into the Chinese market for 3 years at that point and making really like pennies compared to other international markets. So really the Chinese market was not a factor when the movie was greenlit, and no one at Sony thought it was going to be an issue. But whenever Chinese authorities heard that the movie was in production, and there was this movie that would not only valorize the Dalai Lama, but feature scenes of that very sensitive history between China and Tibet, they made it clear to executives that it was going to be a problem. And it wasn't going to be a problem necessarily for the studio, but it was going to be a problem for big Sony. It was going to be a problem for the parent company, which at the time was making TVs and VCRs and had a supply chain based in China that was jeopardized by the release of this film. So that taught Hollywood a very quick lesson, which was don't try and make a movie and think that if you don't play it in China, you still can't face repercussions. That was one of the first early lessons. Sony was in a difficult spot though, because they knew that if they canceled the film, they would be pilloried in America as squelching free expression. So they put the movie out, but they had to do a completely behind the scenes, almost secretive charm offensive with the local consulate, with the embassy in DC, where they essentially had to tell the Chinese authorities what they were doing every step of the way and kind of quasi apologize for it. They tried to pull that classic, like, we apologize for you being offended rather than apologizing for the action itself. Nonetheless, the film comes out and everyone associated with the film, including Brad Pitt, is banned in the country. And it would take about a year and an even bigger, greater charm offensive on Sony's behalf to regain entry. But as you said, the lesson was learned. I mean, everybody now in Hollywood, having watched what had happened with Sony, knew not to touch Tibet. And then, of course, you can extrapolate from there. What other topics are you just not going to broach in any script?
Yeah, wow. And how did these major entertainment companies start to claw their way back then into China? Because obviously it happened again with Disney too, and now you see Disney with theme parks, which obviously you cover in your book as well. You see them in China in a big way. Obviously, everybody remembers the Mulan the live action remake of the animated film, which came out obviously during the COVID period, right, during the pandemic. How does that process then begin for these companies to like start clawing their way back?
Well, I think Sony, as I said, they actually went over soon after and on a little bit of an apology tour with Chinese officials. Disney it's so bizarre, but Disney also released a movie about the Dalai Lama in 1997 called Kundun. And at the time, they had the same issue. In fact, Henry Kissinger was brought on retainer to help them navigate their sensitivities with the Chinese authorities. Disney had already been scouting land for a theme park when that film was released. So much like Sony, they had bigger holdings and bigger investments and bigger ambitions that were jeopardized by the release of the film. In Disney's case, because you're right, today they're by far the most successful Hollywood studio in the market. They had to send Michael Eisner, who was the CEO at the time, over to meet with Xu Rongji, and the two men met together. And there's a transcript of the meeting, which is, as everyone on this call knows, just like a reporter's dream. I'm sure I am almost certain that at least one of the parties did not know he was being recorded because the transcript is quite damning, and it basically, Michael Eisner, the CEO, apologizes and grovels for making the film, and he says something extraordinary. He says, the bad news is that we made the film, the good news is that nobody saw it. And through that and through cutting some very creative deals and making some very ambitious pledges to build a theme park on the mainland, to of course give Chinese local entities majority control of that theme park, Disney's able to get back in. And then frankly, on the strength of their programming and on the savvy of the deals they cut, they become the biggest Hollywood studio in mainland China by far. They, until very recently, were the only one with a big theme park, and their movies, until very recently, routinely would gross hundreds of millions of dollars at the box office. Now, they knew in 1997 that all of that was jeopardized by the release of Kundun, and that's why it was so sensitive, and they needed people like Henry Kissinger to help them navigate it.
Yeah, that was fascinating. That quote in your book really stood out to me, right? Where he basically was like, "Oh, the good thing is no one saw it." Talking about his own film in that way, it seemed very like self-flagellating. One thing that also kind of fascinated me was this sort of dance these executives had to play between the actors, and people like Scorsese, who obviously they need to keep happy and they need to, placate, and then this huge market, right, controlled by, a regime that they didn't fully understand and weren't kind of prepared to deal with the consequences of, offending, right? How did that sort of balance and that dance, play out and come in during even in the 90s?
Yeah, I mean, even in the 90s, and this is why when I was reading these stories, I would think about more recent examples like the NBA, because Disney's groveling and Sony's charm offensive, like these were reported on at the time. People knew that this was happening and that China was upset about it, and Chinese authorities, as they are wont to do, like made it very clear too. Like you just had to pick up People's Daily and you could read about how angry they were that these films were being made. And so I think, so then whenever there became this awareness or this concern that they might start making changes or even canceling the productions in response, there were open letters from people like Spike Lee and Barbara Streisand saying, don't squelch free expression, don't let China dictate what's going to happen here. It's interesting though, I don't know if we would see that kind of response today from the creative community, at least. I think there are certainly some writers, directors, and actors who don't rely on China and don't need their films to play in China, but far fewer than there were in 1997. And I think that's one reason why, with the more recent examples like John Cena or like with the NBA, if we see backlash to any kind of groveling or acquiescing to the CCP, it's more from a political arena than a creative one.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so, the issue of censorship, how did that start kind of flowing in from China to Hollywood? From reading your book, it first started with gambling and vice and nudity and sex and so on. But how did that become this sort of explicit directive then for political censorship?
Well, so China starts accepting Hollywood movies around 1994, and partly it was because of the modernizing of the economy that was happening at the time, but the other thing that was going on was that Chinese movie theaters themselves were really struggling because all China was showing were like medicinal propaganda films that no one wanted to go see. So they started letting Hollywood movies in because they needed better ticket sales, and it worked. Actually, it worked really well, and about 10 movies started coming in a year, even though but from the start, each print had to, not each print, but each movie had to be viewed by the censors to see that they would be approved. And then over time, as more movies started coming in, so it jumped from 10 to 20, and then from 20 to 34 a year in 2012, as more movies started coming in, obviously you could read, at the time it was SARFT, the state administration that oversees radio, film, and television. There was SARFT, and then it more recently moved into the Ministry of the Publicity Department. But you could read the codicils of what was allowed and what wasn't allowed. I think what happened more on a more organic level, I guess you could say, is that studios just started seeing what was getting in and what wasn't, and what cuts were being made and what cuts weren't. And they started to, much like the high profile, like 7 Years in Tibet example, they just started to really ingest what was allowed and what wasn't allowed. And they knew what to watch for and what not to watch for. And a lot of them started setting up offices in Beijing with local staffers who could tell them things that people in Los Angeles wouldn't have ever thought of, right? Like, oh, that color harkens back to a bad dynasty, right? We can't use that color or whatever, that kind of thing. But it was baked into the process from day one. The idea that you would send, before any movie could be shown in theaters, you would send a copy to the authorities, and sometimes they would let it in with no changes. Sometimes they would request changes before letting it in, and other times they would just reject it. And I think something that really forced Hollywood to learn from one another was that very rarely did a memo come from Beijing saying, we've rejected your film and here's why. So they really had to just learn by example.
Yeah, sounds very familiar to the red lines that I think all China reporters and Hong Kong reporters find themselves sort of navigating today. I just want to remind our audience that you can send your questions anytime at question, that singular question, at fcchk.org. We actually have a couple of questions already, which thank you guys so much for, and I will get to in a little while. But I just wanted to ask Erich a few more questions here. So, how did all this start also changing under Xi Jinping and start changing then when the relationships or tensions between US and China became more and more pronounced? And also, how do you think this current period that we're in, right, compares to sort of the Cold War period where Russia was so clearly portrayed as the aggressor in Hollywood, and where there was none of that kind of censoring or pandering to the sort of enemy or to the sort of state that was competing with the US for global supremacy. The Hollywood was very, very much in step with that, and so I would be keen to hear your sort of take on that comparison and how things are so different now and why.
I think that Xi has changed so much, and I'll give you an example. In my book, I talk about this remake of the movie Red Dawn that came out in 2012, and the original Red Dawn. It's very interesting to revisit these past couple of weeks, but the original Red Dawn came out in the mid 1980s, and it's about a group of high schoolers whose hometown is invaded by Soviet forces, to your point about the Cold War, and they have to fight back. And it's kind of like a good guys versus bad guys, only it's high school football players versus Soviet military officers. And MGM remade the film in 2010, and they staged it as a Chinese invasion. And again, when Chinese authorities made it clear they did not like that this film was being made or released, MGM sent the completed film to a visual effects firm and had them redo everything so that it was a North Korean invasion and not a Chinese invasion. Now, if this had happened today, I think there would just be absolute uproar. When I was doing the research in looking back at the coverage around 2012 of this change, I was struck by how little pushback there was. In fact, the only group I could find that was upset about this China to North Korea switch was a militia in Michigan that thought it was a cop-out. But I think that what that speaks to is just how different most Americans viewed China a decade ago. And making such a change to a movie didn't have as high a stake as it would today, given our relationship with China. And Xi has been largely responsible for that change in tenor. I think I would say that change in tenor, especially when it comes to how Americans have perceived China. And so I think that what's interesting is, if you look at the film industry that Xi inherited when he took over, it was certainly an economic force. I think what he has really tried to do and what he has succeeded in doing is making it more of a political one. And he made it very clear early in his tenure that he was going to follow in Mao's footsteps and sort of treat art as an arm of the state. He even went and very deliberately would issue these lectures on art and art's role in the state in the same location and on the anniversary of when Mao had done the same thing before the revolution. So there were these very deliberate efforts to say this film industry that we've grown into this commercial force will also now become more of a political one. And so as the relations between the US and China really devolved in the Trump administration, what you had were these two film industries that were acting in very different ways. whereas in the US, we now perceived China to be our chief global rival. No movies were exploring that story or that tension at all. But in China, this sort of newly politicized, or I should say newly, I'll say like this politically energized film industry was making all sorts of movies about the US-China rivalry, right? And putting into production all kinds of films that cast America as the villain. And so you have this one industry that has been politicized, and then you have this other industry that remains beholden to the economic access of that politicized market, right? So there's been this bifurcation. So we've spent 20 years now of Hollywood scrubbing its movies of any Chinese villains. Forget villains, I'd say, like even any complexity when it comes to the portrayal of China. And we have a Chinese industry that does not extend the same courtesy, and in fact sees the film screen as a place to explore and amplify those tensions.
Right. Yeah, no, that's totally fascinating, and obviously Wolf Warrior 2 is perhaps one of the best examples of that. Yeah, there are more and more questions coming in, which is really, really great. Thank you for your questions to people who are viewing. I will actually take one of the questions now from Joshua Zimmerman, which I think is sort of really, really relevant, and was a question that was on my mind as I was also reading the book. So Joshua says the theatrical releases is sort of a dying business, with all money going to streaming and content, especially during the pandemic, being primarily released online basically. And China plays no role in that. They're not providing financing, so streamers and streamers are blocked. So isn't this whole issue of Hollywood sucking up to China about to vanish? And he asks. But yeah, I'm curious to hear your take. Right? I mean, you address Netflix and how Netflix is one of the few platforms that are not sort of explicitly beholden to China in the same way, say, Sony or Disney were. But yeah, I'm curious to hear your take on what streaming has done and how it's changed the game.
Right. I'm afraid that my answer might be perceived as just like terribly pessimistic here, but I don't think that this dynamic is changing too much because of streaming. I'll break it down. So I think like one thing is that a lot of the major studios like Warner Brothers, Universal, Disney, they're really bifurcating their business plans, and certainly a lot of the effort is going towards streaming. And you're right that because of China's access or lack of access to those streaming channels, they don't really need to think about China when greenlighting movies on the streaming service. However, all of those companies are part of larger corporate conglomerates that do have some issue, or not some issue, some holding, some consideration to make when it comes to China. So in much the same way that Sony's film arm became this problem for its larger supply chain, you could see something very similar happening if Warner Brothers puts into production a movie that China doesn't like, but sends it to its streaming service. You could still have a world where the larger corporate parent is called to answer for that production. The other dynamic here is that while there is still a lot moving into streaming, what it's done is it's really made the theatrical release strategy much more concentrated. So we're moving into a world now where a studio like Paramount or Disney, they might only start releasing a handful of films in theaters a year. And this is down from, I mean, it used to be quite common for 16, 17 movies to come out a year from a single studio. They're drastically paring that down. But what they're doing is they're reserving the theatrical release for the biggest, most expensive, the most global films possible. And those are movies that are still going to need the China market. So in some ways that gives China more leverage, because now whenever, if you're running Universal and you're greenlighting a movie at a new Fast and Furious movie, and it's going to cost you $300 million, that is going to be one of maybe 6 movies you release theatrically that year. You need it to really work as well as it can. And that's going to mean doing everything you can to get that movie past Chinese censors and into Chinese theaters.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, if we can go back just for a second to what you said about, the Chinese film industry is now totally politicized, but Hollywood is still sort of beholden to China. Do you see that being something that shifts Hollywood's, at least creatives' approach to doing movies about the current environment that we're in, or are you still kind of pessimistic about that too? Because I mean, do you think the commercial interest is too overwhelmingly strong here, right? Because it does seem sort of really really fascinating that where as we're in this moment where popular sort of culture or perception of things like Xinjiang, things like Hong Kong are so heightened. You have the Olympics, being one of the least watched Olympics in history, but Hollywood still seems to, not be touching a lot of these subjects, right? And I'm just curious whether you think there'll be some pressure somewhere on the industry.
I haven't seen it, and I don't know where it would go. I mean, there are a few places. I mean, you had mentioned Netflix, which does have a bit of a longer leash, and has made some films and carried some documentaries that I think other companies wouldn't have touched because they're sensitive to they have sensitive Chinese themes or storylines. Netflix has a bit of a longer leash, but only because they're never getting into the country, and they've tried, and they've just been told to take their ball and go home. So it's given them a little bit of a longer leash. But you look at some of the other new players who have moved into entertainment recently, like Apple. Well, I mean, there's 1.4 billion reasons why Apple would never make anything that could potentially harm access to the Chinese market, right? And so I have to say I don't know, and I also think that it's right now in Hollywood this sort of this sensitivity to anything that might anger China is so calcified that I think a lot of folks just sort of know it's a non-starter. I mean, like I said, if I hear about someone greenlighting the Xinjiang project or something, and I think if there was a studio executive on this call, they'd say, well, like, it's just a bad business decision anyway, right? Like that, no one anywhere is going to go see that movie. Well, I would just challenge that, like, Hollywood has a long history of taking these stories that, as you said, it capture the globe's attention and dramatizing them. But China, forget Xinjiang. I mean, we've never seen Tiananmen Square really explored in a dramatized way, or the Cultural Revolution, at least recently. So I think it's just done a lot of storytelling a major disservice, because it's just essentially shutting off this massive part of the world.
Yeah. And so let's talk for a moment now about how China is gearing up to be the new Hollywood, how China is posturing itself around the world to try to be, that answer to the soft power challenger, right? Coming in and sort of influencing people through sort of their own versions of these movies. I know your book reporting took you to Kenya and other places around the world. I'm curious to see what you think about how they're doing this and how successful they're going to be at doing this.
Yeah, that the second part is the big question. We don't know how successful it will be, but one thing I wanted to, when I set out to write the book, I mean, one thing I really wanted to challenge was this notion, popular in Hollywood, of course, that because Western audiences were never going to see Chinese movies in a robust way, that China's efforts to export its culture would fail. I just thought that was an incredibly just a myopic, kind of egocentric view of looking at things. And I started to look particularly at the Belt and Road Initiative. And I just have to say again, it is so nice to be on a call where I don't have to explain what the Belt and Road Initiative is. I mean, I very hard to explain to someone who's never heard of it what exactly that's all about. But I was very curious because I started to hear about the cultural components of the BRI that were going with along with the investment in the infrastructure and the political aid, all of which was we've known about and heard about for years. There was this, I thought, underappreciated cultural element, and the best example I could find was the 10,000 Villages project, which is this initiative out of Beijing that the Chinese satellite dish company StarTimes is overseeing. And it's an initiative to outfit 10,000 African villages with low-cost satellite dishes that carry all sorts of channels from around the world, but they also carry Chinese channels, Chinese kung fu, Chinese soap operas, Chinese game shows, what have you. And so I went to villages in Kenya where you would have a Belt and Road train station built, down the road from a series of apartments with these bright orange Chinese satellite dishes on them. And the Chinese satellite dishes were essentially introducing the residents to the country that had just built them that train station. And there were fascinating parallels. And these are also obviously parts of the world where the shadow of colonialism still looms. And there were distinct parallels between what the 10,000 Villages project was doing and what the British would do when they would move in. Very similarly, they back in the mid 20th century would erect radio towers that would broadcast these specials on the glories of the British Empire. A lot of the folks I met with in Kenya weren't necessarily replacing Western or Kenyan entertainment with Chinese entertainment, but there was, I'd say, a much steadier diet of it than certainly in the US or certainly in parts of the Western world. I mean, I watched Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon with a family one night over dinner. And I met a 4-year-old boy who lives 2 hours outside Nairobi, whose hero is the Monkey King. And so that exposure that I have to say, I mean, and I think this is critical to the second part of your question, that exposure, which is subsidized. And I think because I don't know how successful this effort would be in a free market of appeal, but because it's subsidized, it kind of gets in front of people, more easily than it otherwise would. I think the other key component of it is political, which is that in a number of these countries, Kenya included, there's been a shift away from the West. Certainly, I was visiting during the Trump administration. There was certainly a shift away from the West, from the supposed chaos of democracy. And in the case of Kenya, there was an administration that was incredibly socially conservative, and they found themselves. They would explain to me, as the film minister in Nairobi explained to me, I love importing Chinese films. They've already been censored for me. I don't need to worry about, pernicious Western values influencing my country's children. And so that is why I want to see more Chinese movies on our screens.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. How do you think that the pandemic has also changed this sort of dynamic, if at all, right? I mean, you saw during the pandemic, millions and millions of people around the world just be confined to their homes and consuming media and consuming streaming, consuming everything sort of like never before. Do you think that makes it more or sort of less likely for China's soft power kind of influence to get through? I mean, obviously the pandemic in the beginning, right, was one that did not portray China in a particularly good light. But yeah, I wonder if you've seen any sort of efforts along those lines as well.
Well, in China, as I'm sure many on this call have seen, like there have already been movies released about China's successful response to COVID's outbreak. I think when I kept in touch with a lot of folks I met in Kenya, and it seems like COVID wise, I think the more pronounced response has been probably on like a supply side, right? Like vaccines, medical supplies coming in. And then of course you can guarantee that any Chinese broadcast or Chinese movie or Chinese TV show that touches on the pandemic is going to cast China's culpability or its response in a very specific way to those parts of the country, right? And these, for instance, these satellite dishes, they don't just carry Chinese kung fu and Crouching Tiger, they also carry Chinese news stations. And so you'll see a similar propaganda effort or a narrative effort there as well.
Yeah. So we have a question here from Amy Sood, which is also sort of in line with what I wanted to ask. Which is that, Hollywood in recent years hasn't actually been all that successful in appealing to China, even when it's tried, right? So we've seen some mainstream Hollywood movies like Chole Zhao's Eternals and Shang-Chi, and also the Mulan live action remake that didn't get a release in China or were not, well received there. What do you think the consequences were for these companies like Disney, for example, and was there a larger kind of lesson here for Hollywood?
Right. So one lesson I think some people in Hollywood have learned is that it really does you no favors to try deliberately to appeal. Back when I started covering Hollywood around 2013 or 2014, there was this trend, for instance, of casting Chinese actors and actresses in very small roles to try and get, what they would do is they'd like put one of these actresses in a role in a movie for 2 seconds, but then blast her all over the posters in China so it looked like she had a bigger part, and then her fans would show up and then realize it was just a glorified cameo. And it was an example of Hollywood really not taking really underestimating Chinese audiences and who saw through the pandering right away and even started calling those actresses flower vases because they had such useless roles in the films. And that was an example, I think, of just how that deliberate pandering backfires. And we see that time and time again. And Mulan, the live action Mulan was an example. I mean, let's set aside like that got into significant hot water for filming in Xinjiang, but even aside from that, I think it's an example of how it underestimates the Chinese market, because I think a lot of Chinese moviegoers looked at that film and said, I can see a Chinese version of a story like that. I don't need to see a Western version of it. And then the other thing is that it taught Hollywood that really anytime you're trying to appeal to the Chinese market by setting a story in China or taking a Chinese story, is you're just sort of setting up a million tripwires that no matter how many employees you have in Beijing and no matter how many Chinese people you hire, you still might get some historical detail wrong. You still might cast something in a light that doesn't get that local nuance exactly right. And then suddenly you might have all over Chinese social media people blasting you for getting it wrong. I think that's also being ingested. But the examples that you cited of the Eternals and Shang-Chi, those I absolutely know that those movies were put into production thinking they were going to make a mint in China. And last year, there are a lot of theories as to why. No one knows for sure. Disney just was almost completely shut out of the market. And I think one theory is that China's authorities wanted to just preserve the box office for local releases for a while. But I know that certainly when those movies were put into production, they were greenlit expecting several $100 million from China. And you know that Chloe Zhao was hired and that Shang-Chi was chosen as a character for the specific reason that they would appeal specifically in China.
Yeah, the Chole Zhao thing is like a very interesting thing to discuss as well, right? Which is that obviously, I think Hollywood saw in her someone who could directly appeal to China and Chinese audiences, but hasn't really worked out that way. What is your sort of view on kind of why that was, and do you think it's sort of an example of how Hollywood just totally underestimated or just didn't fully understand the country or power that they were dealing with here in this moment?
I don't know what they would have done differently. I mean, I think the comments that Chloe Zhao made that were unearthed that got her in trouble. I mean, they had been made a decade earlier in an obscure publication. I struggled to imagine what kind of oppo research Disney could have done that would have made them think that was an issue, or had them discover it. I don't know this to be the case, but I'm speculating that what Chloe Zhao's case taught a lot of studios was that you should absolutely do everything you can to get into China and make a lot of money there. But sad to say, hiring anyone associated with China looks riskier by the day, because you just cannot predict what might cause Chinese authorities or the Chinese public to turn on those people.
Yeah, absolutely. There was actually another Chloe Zhao themed question from Peter Boxka, asking in the context of a proxy war, soft power proxy war between the US and China, what's your opinion of Nomadland? Like, what do you think the impression of Nomadland gives of America in this moment?
I'm fascinated by that because before Chloe Zhao was essentially erased from the Chinese internet, I mean, she was celebrated by state media, not only because she was just this like incredible success, but also because she kept making all these movies about how American capitalist systems didn't take care of the most vulnerable residents. And it's no coincidence that the town in Nomadland is called Empire, right? Like, it's about the I mean, that movie is about the decline of the West in some respects. And so I think you're right. There were a lot of things for China to love there. And I think I'll take the question like one step further, which is that I've been hearing, and I think there are people on this call who hear this far more than I do, that just the overcorrection on some of these issues is just losing more friends than they're gaining. And so I wonder when that might result in comments like that being unearthed and it not resulting in an effective cancellation.
Yeah, totally. And I think that will be a really sort of interesting kind of space to watch. On sort of Hollywood's attitude to China, I mean, do you think that Chinese viewers, even the Chinese government is starting to kind of sort of, I don't know, maybe in this moment where China has become a bit more isolationist, right, and a bit more sort of inward looking, do you think Hollywood has then less and less of a role to play, and this game of these major studios and corporations trying to throw everything out there is just not gonna work, right? Do you think that there is sort of like a misreading that Hollywood has of the moment that we're in history right now?
And in a couple ways, I think economically there's a sense among some in Hollywood especially those who have a little bit of distance from it, that Hollywood just got completely played, because here we are 25 years after movies started getting into China at all, and the studios are just doing everything they can to preserve access, while China just makes it more and more clear by the day that they don't need Hollywood nearly as much as Hollywood needs China. That, I think, is the economic component there. I think your question about misreading the moment is really interesting, because I think that there are some executives who are really scared about legacy issues here, and will, in retrospect, we interpret the censorship, the acquiescing, the pandering, will we interpret all of that as helping fuel the rise of a geopolitical rival? And so I think there are real concerns about that on a legacy perspective, and then more practically, I'd say there are concerns that it just could become a political nightmare for some of these studios. I mean, you saw this. I don't know how much everyone over there is following. There's this real controversy, this big firestorm right now at Disney over this anti LGBT bill in Florida, and Disney is toggling back and forth and speaking out against it. And a lot of conservatives, including the governor of Florida, have said, how dare Disney opine on domestic political issues when they operate in a company with Uyghur camps, right? So it is really becoming something that I think politically a lot of the studios don't know how to address. And I will also say, I mean, just because I just mentioned that rather conservative response, I've even found in the response to this book that it's gotten drastically more bipartisan in just the past year.
Really, that's interesting. So you're finding more and more Republicans sort of pick up on the themes in your book as a sort of like, oh, warning of, how China has infiltrated our culture kind of thing? Or?
Yeah, well, I knew when the book was coming out that it was like, it had like two like favorite targets of the right. It was about Hollywood and China. So it was always like the first question is like, who's worse? But I have to say, like, I think among Democrats and those on the left, I think especially now that President Trump's out of office, I think that it's being engaged on more and more of a bipartisan level. Although, to be fair, like even during the whole NBA issue, that was something that Democrats and Republicans were speaking out about in pretty equal numbers too.
Totally. I mean, I think that's what we're seeing, in general, right? Especially, heightened after Ukraine as well. That the problem or the issue with China is seen very, very much in a bipartisan lens, for sure. But yeah, I mean, I think what you said just now really, really sort of gets to sort of the heart of your book in many ways, right? Like Hollywood, Sony, Disney, they're not just any corporations, right? They're corporations that sort of represented the American soul in many ways through movies, through film, through pop culture, and so it's not just any company that is sort of pandering to China. It is perhaps one of the most symbolic, right, of industries and companies, Hollywood, right? And sort of just throwing it forward a little bit. I know you said that you're sort of pessimistic on seeing things sort of change or evolve, but you did mention the political pressure, right, and like how these companies are more and more getting called out, and we have seen the impact of that, at least locally, domestically in the US. With BLM, with LGBT issues, with Disney, so obviously casting more and more diverse, or having more and more diverse storylines, right? And Kanto was celebrated, right, for portraying LGBT storylines for the first time. When do you think that will sort of change the dynamic, or will it ever? Because obviously, is there just no commercial interest then? Is there just no commercial interest to be taking on these more critical storylines, say about Hong Kong or Tibet again, or Xinjiang or whatever?
I think, yeah, I think that there's right now there's this bifurcation that's happened where you're right, a lot of the advancements we've seen, the progress we've seen in terms of representation has stayed largely domestic, and addressing issues of China have remained relatively out of sight and out of mind. And I also just I think it also I mean, everyone on this call who's reported out of China knows how much these bureaucracies exist on kind of a individual level, and the sort of the individual risk assessment. And so I think a lot of these studios, it comes down to a risk assessment, right? Are you really going to be the executive who says, let's make the Tibet movie? And I think your point is a really smart one, which is that there's a reason that this trips people up in the US more than if Boeing was getting entangled in China, which they did. But I think that the movies, Americans, fairly or not, have come to expect them to serve a certain role. And throughout history, we have even conscripted the movies, right? During World War II, or as you said, during the Cold War, America really expected the movies to serve a kind of hearts and minds function. And I think that's exactly why people get so queasy when they hear about that being corrupted in a specific way. But like I said, the economic reality of Hollywood right now just doesn't support that kind of storytelling. It's not to say someone couldn't come along, or a smaller entity like there's the smaller production company called A24 that does smaller movies. Like certainly they might be someone who could bite something off like that, but it's going to be very hard to cast. It's going to be very hard to get financing. I mean, like it's like anyone on this call will know, like you just start to see the tentacles growing everywhere.
Right. Yeah. And, obviously one thing that we were all watching in Hong Kong too was the Oscars, right? Which weren't shown here and wasn't shown obviously in China because of Do Not Split, right? So I guess like perhaps even if a smaller documentary company or a smaller studio takes something on and then it gets celebrated by the industry, there are still consequences to pay, I guess, as well.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, we have a couple of minutes left, and it is a tradition that we ask all our guests what else they're reading at the moment, besides obviously your book. And so, yeah, if you can share with us what else you're reading, that would be great.
I love that question. God, it's like a question that you don't know how often I wish people would ask me that question. So right now I just finished a fantastic memoir by a poet named Natasha Trethewey called Memorial Drive, that is a beautifully written memoir about her mother. And then I just started I'm in a two-person book club with my friend Max, and he and I just started a very famous book that I've never read, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. So I'm on about page 20 of that. Yeah, so that's my, I keep looking over because I have a shelf where I keep all the books I've read so far this year. But those are the two that I can say right now. And I'm trying to think if there was anything else. Oh, and then I also just started on audio a new nonfiction book called All the Troubles of Our Days, which came out last year. It was a pretty big book. It is like one of those stories that like every journalist, just to be able to stumble onto this story is incredible. This writer's great aunt was a Milwaukee woman who moved to Germany and became like a key member of the resistance against Hitler. So it's like a biography memoir that I'm like literally 6 pages in, and I can tell it's fantastic. So that's probably my longest answer of the night, but that's what I'm reading. Yeah.
Well, those are great suggestions for all of us who are stuck at home because we're sort of back to 2020 pandemic situation.
I know you are. I know. I'm so sorry.
But yeah, so thank you again for joining us. Erich's book is great, fantastic. Would highly recommend anyone to get it. I got it on Kindle myself, so it's available to anyone in Hong Kong there, or through Book Depository or Amazon or whatever. But thank you again, Erich, for joining us, and thank you all for tuning in this lunchtime. Thank you.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.